Hello, 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 and welcome to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English, the show where you can listen to fascinating stories and learn weird and wonderful things about the world at the same time as improving your English. I'm Alistair Budge, and today is a special episode. English Learning for Curious Minds is only just a couple of years old, but it recently passed 1 million downloads. It feels strange to say this, but there we go. So, I wanted to mark the occasion with an extra special episode where I give you my best tips and tricks for how to use podcasts to improve your English. I've spent the past 2 years making podcasts. We are now at almost 250. I've talked to hundreds of our members, and along the way, I've learned some of the most effective ways to use podcasts to improve your English skills. So, that's what we'll be talking about today. We'll start by talking about how to use them to improve your listening. Then we'll talk about how to improve your vocabulary. We'll then move on to how to improve your speaking with podcasts, and finish up by talking about writing. In each of these sections, you'll find specific tips and tricks for different goals and for different difficulty levels. So I hope you'll find it useful. Okay then, let's get cracking. I want to start with a couple of administrative points. Firstly, no matter whether this is the first time you've listened to English Learning for Curious Minds, or you have listened to every single episode, that's a message to my mother, by the way. Thank you for listening and being part of this. This show really would be nothing without you. So, from the bottom of my heart, thanks for your continued support. Secondly, all of the tips I'll give you today can apply to almost any podcast, not just this one. In fact, I definitely recommend you to listen to different podcasts in English, to hear different accents, listen to different topics, and listen to people who speak in a different way. That being said, these tips work particularly well with this podcast, with English Learning for Curious Minds, because it comes with all of the learning materials and support that you need. It has literally been designed from the ground up to help you as effectively as possible. And thirdly, our final but most important point, learning English isn't a competition. People have different goals and different aims. Maybe you already work in an English-speaking company and you want to feel more confident and fluent in your conversations with colleagues. Maybe you've never been to an English-speaking country and you just like improving your English for your own curiosity. That's completely fine. Everyone has their own goals, so you shouldn't feel like you need to do everything I'm about to suggest. Think of it like a buffet. Maybe you're ready to try the really spicy dish and get hot and sweaty, but you don't need to. Feel free to pick and choose depending on your goals. The one thing I will assume, though, given that you are already listening to a podcast in English, is that you want to improve your comprehension of spoken English and improve your vocabulary. And for most people, this also implies that you want to improve your ability to be understood and to improve your productive English skills, either speaking, writing, or both. So, with that out of the way, let's start with reminding ourselves what most people do with a podcast they're using to learn English. Perhaps this is what you're doing right now. You press play and listen. Maybe you pick up a few new words, and there is, of course, some subconscious learning going on. The more you listen, the more you understand. Now, you might be thinking, duh, tell me something I don't know. Bear with me here. The reason I mention this is because if this is the only way you are using English podcasts, then you are missing out on some excellent opportunities to improve your grammar, vocabulary, and even speaking and writing. For lots of people, especially if you're the sort of person who listens to a podcast while doing something else, walking, running, driving, or just doing stuff around the house. It's hard to do something else with the podcasts because, well, you're already doing something else. And that's absolutely fine. In fact, one of the great things about podcasts for language learning is that you can fit them in alongside other things. And if this is you, if you normally put on a podcast on the bus or on your drive to work in the morning, here's my suggestion for you. It might sound simple, but in my experience, remarkably few people do it. And this is to work on becoming a more attentive listener. Try to pay as much attention as you possibly can to both the sound of the language and the choice of words used by the speaker. Let's talk about the sound of the language point first. Listening to the sound of a language is incredibly important because if you can't tell the difference between how different sounds are pronounced, then you won't be able to pronounce them correctly yourself. Not everyone can have native level pronunciation, but the more you pay attention to the exact sounds that are being made, the better chance you will have at being able to pronounce them yourself. This might sound quite theoretical, so let me give you a concrete, real-life example. We have lots and lots of listeners from Spain. Listen to what I just said. We have lots and lots of listeners from Spain. Spanish speakers often have trouble with words that begin with consonants. So, a Spanish speaker might have said a listeners and a Spain, instead of listeners and Spain. And listen to the connected speech and intonation in that last sentence. We have lots and lots of listeners from Spain. If you were reading that sentence out loud, you might say, we have lots and lots of listeners from Spain. But when listening to it carefully, you see that the word lots flows directly onto and the D of the and isn't pronounced. I'll say it again, and listen very carefully. We have lots and lots of listeners from Spain. See, you might not have noticed that before, but if you start to train yourself to actively listen out for the sounds, then you will find it much easier when it comes to actually pronouncing these words yourself. Now, let's move on to the next noticing bit and talk about improving your vocabulary by becoming a more attentive listener. Exactly the same idea applies. The more carefully and critically you listen, the better. You can certainly use podcasts, just like any source of input, to help you learn completely new individual words or phrases, words that you have never seen or heard before. But I'd actually think about using podcasts differently in terms of vocabulary building. And that's helping you reinforce words and phrases that you might already know, that might already be in your passive vocabulary. What I mean by this is words or phrases that you would understand if you heard or read them, but that you wouldn't normally produce yourself. An example of this might be words, expressions, and phrases to move from one point to another. The kind of small words or phrases that you might never learn in a textbook or classroom, but are one of the things that separates natural sounding English from obviously non-native English. Again, let me give you an example of this. Well, there you go. I just used the word again to smoothly move from one sentence to another. And I just said, well, there you go. You probably already know what again and well mean, but would you have used them like that in your own speech? If you would have, congratulations. But this is the sort of stuff I'm talking about. Listen out very carefully for these sorts of words and phrases. Notice them and think critically about how they were used. This is a great start and really is about as much as I'd recommend doing for those of you who are listening to podcasts while doing other things. After all, trying to write something down or read a transcript while you're running or driving is a mixture of foolish, dangerous, and plain illegal. So my suggestion here is just to try to improve your noticing skills, particularly on the construction of different sounds and on how words and phrases are used. But really, where podcasts come into their own, where they really excel, where they are really fantastic, is on all of the things you can use them for if you concentrate 100% on them. In other words, don't only listen while you're driving, running, or doing the dishes. Treat them as a learning activity. Sit down at a table or desk and really focus on them. And this brings us to our next section. Now, in this section, I will refer to having the transcript and vocabulary lists for a podcast. In case you were unaware, all episodes of English Learning for Curious Minds, all episodes of this podcast, come with a transcript and key vocabulary, as well as subtitles. Some other podcasts provide transcripts, but most don't, and to my knowledge, there are no other English podcasts that provide subtitles, transcripts, and the key vocabulary in the same way as this one does. So you can follow the tips I'm about to provide without these learning materials, but you will learn more quickly with them. So let's get into it. You're sitting down at your desk or kitchen table. You have decided to set aside 30 minutes to actively learn. What do you do? Well, because we were talking about active listening in the first section, let's continue on that path. As you might expect, if you are fully concentrating, you can do everything we talked about in the first section, but with considerably more success. Let's talk first about building your vocabulary and moving words and phrases from your passive vocabulary to your active vocabulary. Here's what I'd encourage you to do. When listening to an English podcast, keep a notebook open to write down new and interesting words or phrases. Now, what does new and interesting mean? The beauty of this is that the choice of what words you want to learn is completely up to you. I remember talking to a member of Leonardo English from Argentina who worked with aeroplanes, and he had a very good English vocabulary when it came to words related to aeroplanes and aviation, but his day-to-day vocabulary wasn't nearly as good. The point is that the most useful vocabulary for you depends on, surprise, surprise, you. And for most people, there is little value in learning words that you won't need in your day-to-day life. If you are listening to the episode on whaling, for example, you might hear the word harpoon. If you didn't know what it meant, it was the weapon that was used to hunt whales. But thankfully, this is a pretty irrelevant word for most people nowadays. So if I were you, I wouldn't waste my time and energy trying to remember it. But for words and phrases that you hear and think, that's the kind of thing I would say in my own language, this is where you should focus your energy. And here's how I do it. In your notebook, write down the original word or phrase. Write down how it was used in context. So write down the entire sentence or clause, underlining the new word or phrase. If you need to, if it is a particularly new word or phrase, you can write down the definition, either in English or in your own language. Then I practice writing a different sentence with it. Try to use it in a different way. There are tools online, such as Ludwig or Sentence Stack, which will help you see if you have used it in the right way. and then repeat it out loud, ideally several times. If you do this, you are significantly more likely to actually be able to remember the word or phrase when it comes to the time to use it yourself. And it's not hard to understand why. If you're just listening and notice it while you're doing something else, you only hear it once. If you're fully concentrating, you write the word down, you write it down in context, you write down the meaning, you try using it in a sentence, and you try speaking it out loud. Just think of how much more impactful this is. You haven't just heard it once, you have interacted with the word or phrase an additional 5 times. Of course, you can combine this with other ways of memorizing vocabulary, such as flashcards or the gold list method. But the point I'm making is that just by doing this, you have engaged with the word or phrase 5 times more than you would have just by listening. One member of Leonardo English, an amazing German lady called Isabella, even told me she makes a little list of new words or phrases she heard in an episode and decided she wants to use, and makes a point of ticking them off as she uses them in her English conversation classes. The key here, as you have guessed, is to make sure you actually use the new words or phrases you are trying to learn. Otherwise, they will, at best, just continue to sit in your passive vocabulary. So, that's improving your vocabulary. Let's move on to our third and fourth sections, speaking and writing. Now, you might not have thought that you could improve your speaking or writing skills with podcasts, but in the next few minutes, I'll give you some tips on how you can do just that. First up is speaking. Here, I'm going to give you an intermediate tip, an advanced tip, and, just for fun, a super professional tip. Our intermediate tip is to get into the habit of recording yourself speaking, having used a podcast episode as a prompt. One of my favorite ways of using podcasts for this is to record yourself giving a summary of an episode. You can use the show notes or transcript as a prompt to jog your memory and try to speak out loud what you heard. This is a particularly good skill to develop if you work in English, as being able to listen to extended dialogues and extract the key points is a valuable skill in any business environment. You could also use the podcast as a way to share your thoughts on the topic. What did you think? What is your view on what you just heard? I always ask people to share their thoughts in our community, and we have some really interesting perspectives being shared. And yes, you can share audio recordings there too. If you are particularly interested in improving your pronunciation and you have the transcript of an episode, you can record yourself actually pretending to be the host of a podcast. You literally read it out loud, record yourself, and then compare yourself to the original. You might be thinking, can I just speak out loud? Do I actually need to record myself? Of course, you can, but recording yourself has several benefits. Firstly, it actually forces you to do it, and do it for a fixed period of time. Tell yourself that you need to press record and not stop talking until the timer hits a certain time. Perhaps just 1 minute to start, then 2, and you can work your way up to giving a 5-minute uninterrupted talk. Secondly, recording yourself allows you to recognize your mistakes. Recognizing your mistakes when you speak live is really hard. Even if you are speaking with a native speaker, they will often not point out when you make mistakes. And recording yourself and listening out for your own mistakes can be an excellent way to get better at self-correction. And the third reason is that it can be really helpful with tracking your progress and staying motivated. If you are the sort of person who is learning independently, outside a classroom, it can be hard to see that you're actually making progress. If you record yourself, then it's really easy to see how far you have come. And just on a practical level, you don't need anything fancy. Just the inbuilt microphone on any mobile phone is perfect. You might also be thinking, shouldn't I be speaking to other people, not to myself? Yes, definitely. This shouldn't be done instead of speaking to other people, but it can be done in addition to it. The reality is that not everyone has the chance to speak to other people in English all the time, let alone native speakers. So recording yourself, speaking to yourself, can be a great option if you don't have the opportunity to speak much in English. Okay, our advanced technique to improve your speaking skills with podcasts is shadowing. If you haven't heard of shadowing before, essentially it involves repeating a piece of text just after the narrator, copying what they said exactly. It is a technique that almost every successful polyglot and successful language learner swears by because, well, it is incredibly effective. We have an extended guide on shadowing on our blog, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but here's how I'd use it with podcasts. I'd set aside a small amount of time each day, let's say 10 to 20 minutes. Find a section of a podcast episode that you want to shadow, that you want to work with. It should be no more than 5 minutes long. I would even start shorter. Even a minute or two is fine. Listen to the original audio. Assuming you have the transcript, scan through, look through, and see if there are any tricky words that you might struggle to pronounce. And listen to how the narrator says them if you need to. Then, press play and read the text out loud very shortly after the original. If you haven't done it before, it will feel strange. But if you stick with it, I'm confident you will see excellent results. It helps pronunciation, connected speech, word stress, and really will make you sound like a much more natural English speaker. Again, there's a guide on the Leonardo English blog with a lot more information on this, so I definitely recommend checking that out if you want to do it. And I said I'd give you a super advanced, professional even, way in which you can use podcasts to improve your speaking. I actually found out about this after speaking to an amazing member of Leonardo English from China who is doing a master's in interpreting. She listens to a podcast and practices doing simultaneous interpreting, imagining that she is having to translate an episode real time into Mandarin. Of course, this is a very advanced technique, so it does come with that warning, but feel free to give that a go if you would like to give yourself a real challenge. Right, let's move on to our last section, writing. This is a short section because, really, everything I spoke about with recording yourself can be done in writing. You can write down a summary of what you heard, you can write your own thoughts and opinions about it and share them online. And you can even transcribe it. You can try listening to a podcast episode, writing down what you heard, and comparing that with the original transcript. Of course, these activities develop a different set of skills, your writing skills. And even if you think, well, speaking is much more important than writing, I would strongly advise you to not overlook the power of writing, to not think that writing is unimportant. Writing is an incredibly powerful skill in terms of forming ideas and structuring what you want to say. Writing also gives you the chance to think more critically about the words and phrases you want to use. And perhaps counterintuitively, writing ends up improving your speaking skills. To explain how this works, writing gives you the time to think that you don't have when speaking. You can use this to your advantage by choosing different, new words or phrases. And because you have started using them in writing, you will be more likely to recall, to remember them when it comes to speaking. And if you've learned them in a podcast, then you will already know how to pronounce them. Okay, so those are my top tips and strategies on how to use podcasts to improve your English. In case you haven't guessed, I am a huge proponent, a huge believer in the power of podcasts for learning English. I've spoken to hundreds of you and have seen the impact that podcasts have had on your language learning journey. So, whether you are just getting started with podcasts or you have been listening for a long time now, I hope these tips will help you become a more confident and more effective learner of English. Okay then, that is it for today's unusual episode on how to use podcasts to improve your English. For those of you thinking, hang on, where have all the curious stories gone? Don't worry, this is a one-of-a-kind episode. Normal programming will resume in the next one. As always, and in fact, even more than always, I would love to know what you thought of this episode. How long have you been using podcasts to learn English? How have you been using them? Have you been using any of the strategies I spoke about in this episode? Have you found them to be effective? And are there others that I should have mentioned? I would love to know. You can hit me up, you can email me on hi@leonardoenglish.com. The place you can go for all of that is leonardoenglish.com. You've been listening to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English. I'm Alistair Budge, you stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Hello, and welcome to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English, the show where you can listen to fascinating stories and learn weird and wonderful things about the world at the same time as improving your English. I'm Alistair Budge, and today is going to be an unusual episode. It's unusual because you might think you've heard it before. The first episode I ever made was called Meet the English Learning for Curious Minds podcast. Perhaps you've already listened to hundreds of episodes and you think you've already met the podcast. But don't worry, this will be a bit different, or at least it will be significantly updated. In this episode, I'm going to talk about myself and this podcast. I'll talk about how things have developed since I started it. I'll give you a bit of a private, behind-the-scenes look at how the sausage is made. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I've learned in the past 3.5 years. Okay then, let's get right into it. So, perhaps you've already listened to the very first episode of English Learning for Curious Minds. Perhaps you've listened to every episode of English Learning for Curious Minds. If so, you're amazing, thank you. No matter whether this is the first episode you've ever listened to, or you've listened to every single one of them, let me start by telling you a little bit about me, the host of the podcast. I'm Alistair Budge. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. I'm British. I grew up in a bunch of different places in the UK, from the south of England to just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. I've lived most of my life in London, but I definitely not call myself a Londoner. I'm not actually in the UK right now. In fact, I haven't actually lived in the UK for quite a long time. For the past 6 years, I've been living on a tiny island called Malta, which is in the Mediterranean Sea, just south of Sicily. Your next logical question might be, why? That seems like an unusual place to be, so what are you doing there? The answer is actually quite simple. My wife was offered a job at the university here. We knew absolutely nothing about Malta. I didn't even really know where it was. But we thought, well, why not? And packed up everything from London and moved. Her job was originally a 1-year contract, which turned into 2 years, 3 years, and, well, life can surprise you. We're still here 6.5 years later. So let me tell you a bit about this podcast, about English Learning for Curious Minds. I started it at the end of 2019, 3.5 years ago. To be completely honest with you, I started it as a bit of an experiment to see whether anyone would listen. The idea behind it came from my own experience, not as an English teacher, but as a language learner. See, like you, I imagine, I think of myself more as a language learner than as a teacher. I've learned lots of different languages to varying degrees. Like lots of people of my generation in Britain, I learned French at school. But as any French person who meets a British tourist will know, the general standard of language teaching in Britain is not very good. In any case, I loved languages and tried to find every opportunity I could to pursue this. I ended up studying French and Italian at university to what I guess would be a C1 or C2 level, then going on to do a master's in Chinese studies. As part of these studies, I spent a year studying at both French and Italian universities, and I also taught English in China. So I know what it's like both to teach and to learn. In all these years, both as a student and a teacher, observing my own behavior, that of my friends, and that of my students, the people I was teaching, one thing was abundantly clear. Learning is 100 times easier if you are actually engaged with what you are learning, if you find it really interesting. I saw this with my own behavior. When it came to textbook-based learning, I always did the minimum amount of work. I knew I could pass the exams by doing this, and there were many more fun things to be doing at university than sitting down with a grammar book. But when I found something that I actually cared about, when I found a book or a film director I loved, I would consume everything I could, and it didn't feel like studying. Now, what does this have to do with English learning for curious minds? Well, in my native language, English, I read a lot. I watch documentaries, go down Wikipedia rabbit holes. I describe myself as being quite obsessive in terms of enjoying learning about history, politics, economics, about how the world works. So I thought, what if there was a way to combine this thirst for knowledge, for information, with learning a language? As to the format of how this could be delivered, I had never had much success with apps or gamified style learning, streaks and stars and all that kind of stuff. Reading and watching films or series both have their advantages, but they are imperfect. If you're simply reading, you don't have the oral element. You can't hear spoken language. And if you're watching something, you either have subtitles, which are tempting to read, or you have no subtitles and you can miss words. But what is the best of both worlds? Something where you can listen and have a transcript to refer to check what has been said, which helps you remember new words and expressions. So, I thought, as a language learner myself, I know that listening and learning about interesting stuff is the most effective way for me to learn a language. Not only do you listen to real native content, but you learn about stuff that you would be curious about in your own native language. Surely, I can't be the only person in the world who would like this. I figured that the only way to test it was by trying. So I wrote the scripts for 5 episodes, asked a friend for a microphone, recorded them, built a basic website, and hit publish. The first one came out in December 2019. It was the first Meet the English Learning for Curious Minds episode. And you can still listen to it now, if you like. It's episode number 1. Right from the start, I wanted to offer people the ability to pay a small amount of money to access all of the learning materials, the transcripts and vocabulary. I knew from my own experience that these resources are incredibly helpful, valuable, and can be a crucial part of going from passive consumption to active learning. So I figured, well, I would happily pay for something like this. I thought perhaps other people might do so too. Now, fast forward to today.
The podcast has been listened to over 4 million times by people in literally every country in the world. I checked, and there have even been listeners in the Vatican City. But I can neither deny nor confirm that the Pope is a listener. That's actually a privacy thing. All you can see in the podcast analytics is the country, nothing about the individual person. So let me tell you a little bit about what has happened since I recorded the first one, so I can take you on a bit of a journey through the history of this show. I told you I started this as a bit of an experiment. I gave myself 3 months, thinking if it doesn't go anywhere, if nobody listens and nobody becomes a customer, well, I've only lost 3 months. And it won't be a waste of 3 months because I'm sure I'll have fun and learn something. After these 3 months, the show had about 50,000 downloads and paying members from a dozen or so different countries. It was off to a good start. But it was still, to a certain extent, not my full-time job. When I first started, I was still working part-time as a marketing consultant to pay the bills. See, before starting this podcast and the business behind it, I had a relatively successful career working in technology startups in London. So when I started the podcast, I was also consulting on the side. Anyway, about 6 months after starting this podcast, I decided to go all in, to fire myself from the consulting jobs and focus on making the best possible product for curious independent learners, for you. Things got a little bit more professional. Now we have a professional editor, professional researchers, scriptwriters, and teachers working to create the learning materials that come with the show. There are now hundreds of thousands of people who listen every month, and we have paying members from almost 100 countries. Now, let me tell you a bit more about the journey to get to today, where we are now, and what we have planned for the future of this podcast and for Leonardo English. When I first started making the podcast, it was super unprofessional. I knew absolutely nothing about how to make a podcast. Naively, I thought it was not much more complicated than getting a microphone and pressing record. Of course, you can't do a podcast without pressing the record button and talking into a microphone, but there is a lot more that goes into making one than that. In fact, I listened to the first version of this episode back from December 2019, and I felt pretty uncomfortable listening to it. Part of me thought it would be better to remove that episode completely and replace it with an updated one. But I always think it's fun to see where people and companies have come from. It makes it all a bit more real, you know? So, anyway, I've left the old versions up for you to see for posterity's sake. We are at almost 400 episodes now, and ever since that first episode, we've made 2 new ones every single week, covering all sorts of weird and wonderful topics. As for the process of going from an idea to a finished episode, it's actually quite a lot more complicated than you might think it is. First, there's the idea, the concept for the episode, or for the series. I'm often asked how we come up with the ideas, but the truth is that I have a massive list of potential ideas. Plus, we have lots of great suggestions from members, so there is absolutely no shortage of potential ideas. Then we plan out the structure for the episode. The research team does amazing work researching the subject matter at hand and then writing an outline. Next up is the script writing itself, where we try to turn an interesting subject into a compelling story. Sometimes this is really easy, if there's a story about someone's life or a particular historical event with lots of twists and turns. Sometimes it's a bit trickier, for example, if it's about a political or philosophical concept, but we try to draw out the human elements of it to turn it into a nice story. When the script is complete, I'll normally leave it for a few days, then go back and rewrite large parts of it. Then comes the recording, That bit's not so complicated. It's literally a case of having a microphone and pressing record. But I hadn't appreciated until starting this podcast that it is actually quite difficult to get good quality sound. I live in Malta, which is essentially a 24/7 construction site. So finding a time where there are no hammers or drills is difficult. I also live across the street from a pub and have 2 young children. So finding a time when there are no drills, no children, and no people drinking beer across the streets is not easy. In fact, for about 6 months, I had to record every episode after 11 o'clock at night, as that was the only time where there was relative peace. Anyway, after the recording comes the editing. Up to episode number 100, I think it was, I did all of the editing myself. Now we have a professional editor, so if you've been listening since the start and you've noticed the sound quality getting better, well, you have our editor, Eze, to thank for that. After the editing, we go through and create the worksheets, including custom definitions for advanced vocabulary, vocabulary explanations, and, as of recently, a series of comprehension and vocabulary questions, a quiz to test your knowledge after listening to the episode. We write a description of the episode, write a summary, find a relevant image, add tags to it so people can find it easily on the website, create a little YouTube video, then upload it. All in all, from start to finish, one episode can take anything from 8 to 20 hours to make. And this happens twice a week. You get to enjoy the finished product, but there is a lot of work behind the scenes with making this style of highly researched and produced type of podcast. Now, if this is one of the first episodes you've listened to, you might be wondering, where should I start? It is a good question. There are already literally hundreds of hours of episodes to listen to. Should you start with the first one? The last one? Somewhere in the middle? It's tricky because many traditional language courses have a clear start and end. You start on lesson 1, you go on to lesson 20 or whatever it is, and then you have completed it. You get a nice little certificate that makes you proud, and you're done. With English learning for curious minds, there is no clear start, and there will never be a clear end. This is by design. It's on purpose. It's also how language learning works in the real world. There is no finish line. It's about the journey. So, back to the question, where to start? I would certainly not recommend that you start from the first episode, because I think the quality of our episodes has continued to improve over time. I might even say that the first one is the worst one. I'd say that you should start from the episodes that seem the most interesting to you. It's well documented that it's easier to learn a language if you're interested in the subject matter, and it's also just blindingly obvious. So start with the episodes that are most interesting to you and work from there. The best way of finding interesting episodes is through searching on the Leonardo English website, as you can type in anything: gangsters, queens, British humour, and you'll see episodes about that topic. Listen to what you are interested in. Ignore what you are not. And that is a surefire way of staying motivated, which is half the battle with the language learning. I'm biased here, of course, but I think you should also try to listen with the interactive transcript and subtitles. If you're wondering what an interactive transcript looks like, it's much more than just text. The transcript has translations in 12 languages, so you can tap on any word or expression and get the definition in your language. This also works with the subtitles, so if there is any word, expression, or even sentence you don't understand, you can tap on it and you'll see a translation in your language. Now, why am I saying you should use them? Well, even if you can understand most of what is being said without the transcript, seeing the words written down at the same time as hearing them will help your reading comprehension, your spelling, and therefore your written English. And the fact that you have all of the advanced words and phrases explained for you means you have extra help if you don't understand something. Now, the final point I want to say is that even though we've been going for 3.5 years and we're almost at episode number 400, I see this as right at the beginning of an exciting journey. Not only are we working hard to make 2 fascinating episodes of English Learning for Curious Minds every single week, but we're working on new challenges, new shows like Pioneers of the Continuum, and new ways of helping curious, independent learners like you improve their English in a more interesting way. There are clearly a million different ways for someone to learn a language. Listening and learning with this podcast is just one of them. So, the last thing I want to say to you is thank you. Your time is valuable. You've either already chosen or are perhaps at the start of choosing to listen and learn with English Learning for Curious Minds. And this is a wonderful thing. When I made the first episode, I had no idea that so many people, including you, would listen and learn with something I made as a bit of an experiment. And knowing that it's helping you and people like you, well, that makes me very happy indeed. Okay then, that is it for this unusual episode, Meet English Learning for Curious Minds, version 2. I hope it was interesting nonetheless, and whether you have indeed been listening from right at the beginning, or whether this was the first episode you've ever listened to, well, I hope it was an interesting one. As always, I would love to know what you thought about this episode. I'd love to hear from you. How did you hear about English Learning for Curious Minds? How many episodes have you listened to so far? What was your favorite and why? I would love to know, so let's get this discussion started. You can head right into our community forum, which is at community.leonardoenglish.com, and get chatting away to other curious minds. You've been listening to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English. I'm Alistair Budge. You stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Hello, and welcome to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English, the show where you can listen to fascinating stories and learn weird and wonderful things about the world at the same time as improving your English. I'm Alistair Budge, and today we are going to be talking about the death of Princess Diana. It is the story of a princess, the press, the royal family, and what people called the utterly preventable death of a young woman. Okay then, let's get started and talk about the death of Princess Diana. In the early hours of Sunday, August the 31st, 1997, a black Mercedes-Benz entered the Pont de l'Alma underpass, a tunnel under the Seine River in Paris. The car was going fast, with later reports estimating it was travelling at 105 kilometers per hour, more than double the tunnel's 50 kilometer per hour speed limit. There was a good reason for this, or at least you can understand why the driver was going so fast. The car was being chased by a reported 30 paparazzi photographers on mopeds and in cars. Cameras were flashing as the photographers weaved around the car, poking their cameras at the tinted windows, the shutters clicking non-stop. For inside the car was Diana, Princess of Wales, the former wife of the heir to the British throne, and almost certainly the most recognisable woman in the world. Next to her was Dodi Fayed, the son of the Egyptian businessman and owner of the Harrods department store, Mohammed Al Fayed. Nobody knows exactly what Diana and Dodi were talking about on that trip back, but the whole world would know what happened next. At exactly 23 minutes past 12, shortly after entering the tunnel, the driver lost control of the car. The Mercedes smashed into another car and then crashed head-on into a pillar.
Neither Dodi nor Diana were wearing a seatbelt. Dodi Fayed was pronounced dead at the scene, along with the driver, Henri Paul. Diana was still alive, as was the only other occupant of the car, Dodi's bodyguard, a man called Trevor Rees-Jones. She was still conscious and was able to talk to the doctors who were fighting to save her life. Unfortunately, it was an unwinnable fight. The impact from the crash had been so great that her heart was pushed out of place, and this tore a pulmonary vein, causing massive internal bleeding. At 4 o'clock in the morning, after almost 3.5 hours of French doctors fighting to save her life, Diana, Princess of Wales, the woman many people had thought would become queen, was pronounced dead. This much of the story I imagine you will know already, but what we will do in this episode is try to go a level deeper and unpack what was happening before the crash itself, and its aftermath. But first, let me give a very brief reminder about the protagonist of our story. Princess Diana, or Diana Spencer, as she was before she became a princess, was born on July the 1st, 1961, to an aristocratic British family. Her family had extensive ties to the royal family. Diana was a distant cousin of Charles. Diana's grandmother was friends with Charles' grandmother, and Diana's family even lived in a large mansion that they rented from Queen Elizabeth. On the surface, Diana had a very privileged upbringing, but emotionally, it was not a happy one. Her mother left her father when she was 7 years old, and Diana would later say that her childhood was very unhappy. Her family was well known in aristocratic British circles, but it wasn't until her relationship with Prince Charles that she truly became a household name across the world. At the age of 20, she married Prince Charles in a ceremony that was watched by over 750 million people. It was a spectacle of royal pomp and glamour that made her an icon overnight. But while her marriage to Prince Charles was made out to be a fairy tale for the press and the public, the reality was quite different. Behind the scenes, the marriage was troubled from the start, with the most well-known issue being Charles's ongoing affair with his former lover, Camilla Parker Bowles, who you might know is now his wife. Diana and Charles separated in 1992 and would officially divorce 4 years later, in 1996. In the interests of balance, Diana also had her own fair share of affairs, but she emerged from the divorce in a much more positive light than Charles. And she stood on her own 2 feet. She was a public figure in her own right. She became deeply involved in humanitarian causes, including raising awareness about AIDS and campaigning against the use of landmines. She did things that no royal had previously done. She hugged a man suffering from AIDS, which was hugely important in debunking the myth that you could catch HIV through physical contact. She walked through a field of live landmines. She had a warmth, approachability, and humanity that no member of the royal family had previously shown, and you could reasonably argue has shown since. Her warmth and charisma made her the so-called people's princess, loved by millions around the world. She had this rare ability to connect with people, particularly the vulnerable and marginalized, and this made her immeasurably popular at home and abroad. But this popularity came at a price. She was relentlessly pursued by the press in a way that no royal before and after ever has been. The tabloids followed her every move, and the public's fascination with her personal life, her relationships, and her charity work was insatiable. She was constantly hounded by photographers, And the scrutiny was so intense that Diana publicly spoke out in a TV interview about quite how difficult it was to live under the media's microscope, and how she felt that she lived in a goldfish bowl. It was this obsession with photographing her, as we'll come on to talk about in a minute, that some people said ultimately led to her tragic death. So, what was happening in the lead up to the crash? Why was Diana in Paris that night? And what role did the paparazzi play in it all? Diana and Dodi Fayed had only met 6 weeks before, but it was a whirlwind romance. They spent the summer of 1997 together, travelling on Dodi's father's yacht in the Mediterranean and staying at his family's villa in the south of France. Although it had only been going on for a few weeks, their relationship had captured the attention of the press, and speculation was rampant about whether the couple were about to announce an engagement. On the evening of August the 30th, they ate at the restaurant of the Ritz Hotel in Paris, which was owned by Dodi's father, Mohammed Al Fayed. After dinner, they decided to leave and head back to Dodi's apartment before leaving for London the following morning. The problem was, as always, the hordes of paparazzi waiting eagerly outside the hotel, knowing that Diana and Dodi would have to leave eventually. But Dodi had a plan to throw them off, to trick them. A decoy car was sent to the front of the Ritz, while Diana and Dodi slipped out through a secret door at the back of the hotel and into the Mercedes. But the plan didn't work. They were spotted. The paparazzi were soon on their tail, chasing the car through the streets of Paris. This takes us back to that tunnel, to the fateful moment when Henri Paul lost control and the car smashed into a pillar. In the immediate aftermath of the news, there was an almost national sense of bereavement in the UK. An estimated 1 million people travelled to London to pay their respects to her, leaving bouquets of flowers and letters of condolence outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, her private residence. The news was full of interviews with members of the public in tears, people who had never met Diana but felt like they had lost a loved one of their own, a wife, mother, or sister. And Britain isn't known to be a nation of people who are particularly comfortable with their emotions. You might know the term stiff upper lip, which is this idea that it is honourable to avoid showing any emotion, even in times of great sadness and despair. But something was different. There were men, women and children in tears at the loss of this woman they had never met. Commentators would later point to it as a defining moment in British history, a time when people in Britain became comfortable with displaying their emotions. For one family in Britain, however, there was no such emotional awakening. The royal family was staying at Balmoral Castle, its large country estate in Scotland. There were some token public statements put out in the press, but the Queen and the wider royal family were criticised for what was interpreted as a cold and emotionless reaction, especially compared to the outpouring of grief from the general public. Diana's funeral took place a week after her death, on September the 6th, and was watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people across the world. If you were one of them, you might remember that her sons, the then 12 and 15-year-old Harry and William, walked behind the funeral procession, together with Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and Diana's brother, the Earl of Spencer. The inclusion of the boys in the funeral procession was highly contentious and was criticised by many as showing an utter lack of compassion. After all, these were two boys who had just lost their mother, and they were being forced to grieve in front of a live crowd of millions and billions more watching on TV. Unsurprisingly, Prince William would later say that walking behind his mother's coffin was one of the hardest things that he has ever done. As you may remember, the guest list at the funeral service itself was a veritable who's who of notable figures. World leaders, past and present, kings and queens, musicians, Hollywood actors and directors. There had initially been concerns that the funeral shouldn't have been held in Westminster Abbey, a large cathedral in London, partly because there wouldn't have been enough guests to fill it. These concerns were clearly unfounded. Every seat was filled, and an estimated 2.5 million people descended on the streets of London to pay their respects. In the weeks and months afterwards, questions started to be asked about who was to blame, and whether her death could have been prevented. Was it simply a tragic accident, or were there other forces at play? Mohammed Al Fayed, Dodi's father, pointed the finger directly at the royal family and made the shocking accusation that Diana and his son were murdered in a plot orchestrated by the British establishment. Many pointed the finger at Henri Paul, the driver, as tests later revealed he had been drinking alcohol, and he was 4 times the legal limit. In other words, he was drunk, he crashed, and that's the end of it. Others laid the blame squarely with the paparazzi, arguing that their pursuit had forced Henri Paul to drive at reckless speeds to avoid them. The paparazzi had never given her an inch of privacy, and to her last breath had used her as a product to squeeze money out of. And in one final display of the transactional nature of the paparazzi's relationship with Diana, as she lay dying in the wreckage of the car, instead of trying to help in some way, or giving the paramedics the privacy to try to save her life, members of the press jumped onto the roof of the car and continued to take photos of the critically injured woman. It was the paparazzi that ultimately bore responsibility, so the argument goes. Henri Paul might have been drunk, but he wouldn't have been driving so fast if the car wasn't being pursued by the paparazzi. And this is not just a theory, it's not just someone's argument. There was a lengthy official inquest into the death, which concluded that, and I'm quoting directly, Diana was unlawfully killed by the grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles, meaning the paparazzi, and of the Mercedes driver, Henri Paul. In other words, if she hadn't been followed by the paparazzi, and if Henri Paul had been sober, she would still be alive today. And going one level further up, some lay the blame at the feet of the public, the people who bought the newspapers and magazines that paid the paparazzi for their photos. A single picture of Diana could go for £500,000, more than €1 million in today's money. So it's hardly surprising that the paparazzi chased her so relentlessly. It is us, the public, who must bear some of the responsibility for endlessly buying the magazines with paparazzi pictures of Diana, and for having such an insatiable appetite to consume every last detail and picture of the private life of someone who was a vulnerable and lonely woman, struggling to repair her life after a nasty public divorce. Now, it has been more than 25 years since the events of that fateful evening in Paris. Her sons have grown up, married, and had children of their own. They both, reportedly, have a visceral hatred and distrust of the press, especially the British tabloid press. And who can blame them? The official verdict was that their mother's death was unlawfully caused first by the paparazzi. Without the paparazzi, these 2 men would still have a mother. Their children would have a grandmother. To wrap things up, perhaps the question to leave you with is to ask what has been learned from Diana's tragic death. It highlighted the dark side of fame and the extreme consequences of a relentless press. But did it change anything? More than 25 years later, her story still serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost behind the headlines. Okay then, that is it for today's episode on the death of Princess Diana. I hope it's been an interesting one and that you've learned something new. You've been listening to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English. I'm Alastair Budge, you stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next episode.